if you're asking, do I think that Biden would at some point really twist the arms of Israel? That is to say, we're going to withhold aid. No, I don't think he would do that. And in some ways, I think the stumbling block here is Hamas more than Israel. I think Israel is ready for a ceasefire because it desperately wants to get more hostages out. Enormous pressure on Netanyahu there.
Where the US has parachuted 30,000 meals into Gaza as they carry out their first airdrop of humanitarian aid. It comes as Joe Biden hints at a ceasefire being a possibility before the start of Ramadan next week. Let's drill into that then, and its likelihood, with Charles Kupchan, who is a former advisor to Presidents Obama and Clinton on foreign policy and is now a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Charles, good evening.
Good to be with you.
We're hearing about a framework. What might that involve?
Well, we don't know the details yet, but from the reporting that's coming out, we hear that there would be a proposed 6-week ceasefire, that during those 6 weeks, there would be an exchange. The hostages, some of the hostages, certainly the women, would come out from Gaza. Exactly how many Palestinian prisoners would come from Israel and be released, we don't know. But that's certainly the outline of the deal. The Hamas has been saying, no, we want more than a temporary pause. We want a permanent ceasefire. Israel says, no, we're not going to give you a permanent ceasefire because that would leave thousands of Hamas fighters to fight another day. So that's where I think the key focus is right now. If you get a ceasefire, then I think the conversation will start focusing on, well, what now? Can we get civilians out of Rafah? Because Israel will start up another military campaign focused on Rafah in the south. May it be possible to convince Hamas to leave or lay down their arms? These are the issues that will be on the table.
Okay. As we also understand it, Charles, one of the sort of last hurdles towards a ceasefire requires an agreement on whether sort of an agreement, I guess, about whether Israel withdraw from northern Gaza, Israeli forces withdraw from northern Gaza and allow northern Gaza residents to return. That's according to Egyptian security sources. I mean, you touched on it there, Charles, that I suppose the concern there will be, does that allow Hamas to rebuild in northern Gaza? Although if Israeli defense forces feel they've done a good enough job there, will they feel comfortable allowing that to happen?
I don't think you're going to see Israel withdraw in a significant way from any major piece of Gaza. And that's because the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, believe the mission has not yet been accomplished. What I could imagine is safe zones where they take out maps and they say, these are areas where civilians can congregate. This is where we will bring the humanitarian assistance. And that's key because right now, the amount of humanitarian assistance flowing in is minimal. And that's in part because there's chaos, because some of the aid agencies aren't willing to operate, because it's too dangerous, because there isn't a sufficient deconfliction of Israeli military operations with the convoys. We saw that just on Thursday, when there were about 100 people killed and hundreds injured when convoys coming in from the south and headed north were mobbed by Gazans. So it is a mess. You get a ceasefire, at least you can see the food, the medicine, the fuel begin to flow in a more orderly fashion.
Okay. Joe Biden's pointing towards a ceasefire, a 6-week ceasefire maybe, being as close as before Ramadan. That starts on the 10th of March. But then also we're talking about the US having to airdrop aid into Gaza because one of their key allies is unable to make the border safe enough to get through, or potentially blocking the border, or not doing enough to alleviate the blockage at the border. So how much influence does Joe Biden really have over this process?
Well, listen, he's been, far as we know, been having some pretty tough conversations with the Israelis, but he does not hold a veto over Netanyahu. He is not able to convince Netanyahu to do more, to limit the nature of the military operation, to focus on a more targeted surgical strike that doesn't harm as many civilians. He clearly would prefer that in terms of the blowback that we're seeing, given we're now at 30,000 plus loss of life on the civilian side in Gaza, civilian and military. So I think that the ceasefire is in some ways the special sauce here, because it would provide a conduit for the aid to go in.
Right.
It would provide breathing room for everybody to sit down and say, how can we avoid going back to what everybody agrees is a horrific level of violence? We're not there yet. And let's be honest, the aid drop from the aircraft is a Band-Aid. And that's because, these pallets of food are heavy. You can't put that many of them on a C-130 or other kinds of transport aircraft.
Okay.
You need them coming in on trucks, and preferably from the sea. That's not happening yet. That could happen if there's a ceasefire.
Okay. And just briefly, Charles, if the US feel and Joe Biden feels a ceasefire is now so overdue, these nudges and winks and backroom conversations aren't getting as close to that as they feel that they should be. As you say, they're a sovereign nation. He can't make them do anything. There are other avenues, aren't there? Do you think other avenues could be explored? I'm thinking of something as drastic, perhaps, as the UN Security Council resolution.
Well, there is a resolution that is on the table that the United States has been supporting. The United States also vetoed several resolutions because they called for a permanent ceasefire rather than a temporary pause. If you're asking, do I think that Biden would at some point really twist the arms of Israel? That is to say, we're going to withhold aid. No, I don't think he would do that. And in some ways, I think the stumbling block here is Hamas more than Israel. I think Israel is ready for a ceasefire because it desperately wants to get more hostages out. Enormous pressure on Netanyahu there. It's Hamas that has to agree for something less than a permanent ceasefire. We'll know in a few days whether we're going to cross that line.